All right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or whatever time you guys are looking at this lesson. So this lesson is about imaginary solutions, and our objective is to be able to find the solutions of a negative square root. And our essential question is, what must I factor out before taking the square root? So at this point, we've talked about different types of solutions. We said, okay, we could have two solutions, we could have one solution, and then we could also have when is it that we have no solutions. Okay, so moving forward, and again, if at any point you need to pause this video, go ahead and do that. So sometimes when we solve a quadratic equation, we run into a solution that has the square root of a negative number. Now, up to this point, I've said, okay, if you get a negative number, then we're just going to say there's no solution. Now, we can handle situations with no real solutions or solutions by using the imaginary number I. Okay, so the imaginary number I. Mathematicians use the imaginary number I to represent the value of the square root of negative 1. So the square root of negative 1 is going to be represented by I. So what is I? So again, I is a way of determining imaginary numbers. So I is equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay? So anytime you see the square root of a negative 1 or a negative number, then we have to bring out this I. Now, on that note, that means that if we take I squared, then I squared is equal to negative 1. All right, so let's look at a couple examples here. So, imaginary solutions and the outcome of a negative square root. And again, it always involves I. So, for example, if we have the square root of negative 5, so technically there's no real solution. But what I want you guys to understand is that the square root of negative 5 is equal to the square root of negative 1 times 5, which can be broken down into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5, which is just equal to I times the square root of 5. Okay? Again, the square root of negative 1 is equal to the square root, is equal to I. Example 2, we have the square root of negative 36. Okay, now we know what the square root of 36 is. It is a perfect square, and the square root of 36 is equal to 6. But we have this negative, and again, the I just becomes, the negative just becomes an I. So we get 6I. All right. Now let's solve these equations. So example 3, we have x squared plus 64 is equal to 0. Okay, now we're interested in solving for x. So the first thing we're going to do is subtract 64 from both sides. Okay, we want to isolate the variable. All right, so the 64 cancels out, and we end up getting x squared is equal to negative 64. Okay, now we want to get x by itself, so the next thing we're going to do is take the square root of each side to get x by itself. So we get x is equal to plus or minus, okay, remember that it does create two solutions. The square root of negative 64 is going to equal plus or minus. The square root of 64 is 8, and since we have a negative, it's going to be 8i. Or we can say x is equal to positive 8i, or x is equal to negative 8i. Okay, so that's two ways of getting that same solution. Okay, example 4, I'm going to go ahead and write it up here. So we got example 4. And we have 7x squared plus 10 is equal to 0. That way you guys are able to see that. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is isolate the variable. So we're going to subtract 10 from each side because we're adding 10. So minus 10, and we get 7x squared is equal to negative 10. Okay, the next thing we want to do is get x by itself. So there's a 7. We're multiplying by 7 to the x squared. So now we're going to do the inverse, which is to divide both sides by 7. So now we get x squared is equal to negative 10 over 7. Okay, and then the last step is to take the square root since we want x by itself. So we get that x is equal to plus or minus. Okay, and again we have a negative, so I'm going to pull out this I, and we're just going to leave this as a square root of 10 over 7. And again, those are our two answers. Now, I want to bring this up again. I know we haven't seen this in a while, but so the discriminant. So if you guys remember, the discriminant is the inside of the square root. Okay, the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And it helps us determine how many solutions are in a quadratic equation. Now, if you guys recall, our quadratic formula was the following. It's the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. And again, this formula up here helped us find all the solutions to a quadratic equation. And again, our discriminant is this part right here that I just highlighted. Okay, now a couple interesting things. If we're just looking at the discriminant, if b squared minus 4ac is positive, then that means that we have two solutions. Okay, so as you guys notice, we have this quadratic and we have two solutions. Okay, if b squared minus 4ac is negative, okay, then we have no real solutions. Okay, now this is the part that we're interested in, because no real solutions means that we have imaginary solutions. Okay, this is where we start getting the I. If b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, then that means that we have one solution, which is at this point. Okay, so I just wanted you guys to remember this from what we did before. All right, so we're going to use a quadratic formula to solve. So we have x squared minus 8x plus 27. Now, up at the top here, I'm going to rewrite our quadratic formula so that we remember what that is. So the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. All right, so the first thing we want to do is identify what a is. Well, a is a number in front of x squared, so a is equal to 1. Okay, our b is a number in front of the x term, so it's negative 8. And our c term is equal to 27. It's our constant term. All right, so we're going to go ahead and plug it into our quadratic formula. So we got x is equal to, okay, so look at the b value, and we're going to take the opposite of b. Okay, the opposite of b. So the opposite of negative 8 is a positive 8. Okay, so that we don't confuse our signs, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So b is negative 8. I'm going to put it in parentheses. We're going to square that. And we're going to subtract 4 multiplied by a, which in this case is 1. And multiply that by c, which is our 27. And this is going to be all divided by 2 times a, which in this case is 1. All right, so we're going to start cleaning this up here. All right, so we have x is equal to, so we have 8 plus or minus, and let's figure out what's in the radical. So we got negative 8 squared is 64 minus 4 times 1. So minus 108. Okay. All divided by 2 times 1, which is just 2 on the bottom. And let's clean this up some more. We got 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 108 is negative 44. Okay. All divided by 2. Now notice that we have a negative radical, and I'm going to continue this up here. Okay, so that means that we have x is equal to 8 plus or minus, and I don't want a negative radical, so I'm just going to change that to an I, times the square root of 44, all divided by 2. Okay, and that would be my answer, and that would be acceptable. Okay, or we could say x is equal to 8 plus I root 44 over 2, and x is equal to 8 minus I root 44 over 2. Okay, and again, that would be a different way of writing our solution. All right, so this problem, I do want you to try it. So at this moment, I would pause the video, try it out before you check your answer. But I'm going to go ahead and work this out. Okay, so again, we're going to use our quadratic formula. Remember, our quadratic formula is x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Okay, so we got that in this case, we want to make sure to set this equal to 0. Okay, we're solving, so that means that x squared minus 10x plus 50 is equal to 0. All right, so now let's identify our a. So a is equal to 1. All right, our b is equal to negative 10, and our c is equal to 50. All right, so a quadratic formula, we're going to plug it in. So we're going to take the opposite of b. So the opposite of negative 10 is a positive 10. So I'm just going to replace it. Plus or minus, hold on a second. So plus or minus the square root of b squared. So in this case, we got negative 10 quantity squared. Okay, minus 4 multiplied by a, which is 1, and multiplied by c, which is 50. All divided by 2, multiplied by the a value. All right, so we're going to continue this. We're going to simplify this. And again, I would strongly advise that we use a calculator for this. We got 10 plus or minus the square root. Let's clean this up. Negative 10 squared is 100. And then we have 100 minus 4 times 50, which is minus 200. All divided by 2 times 1 is 2. And then we get x is equal to 10 plus or minus the square root of negative 100. All divided by 2. Now, we do have a negative inside of the radical, okay, which means that we have no solutions, but we actually have imaginary solutions. So what does that simplify to? Well, we have x is equal to 10 plus or minus. Now, the negative is going to become an I. The square root of 100 is actually 10. So 10i all divided by 2. Now, the nice thing is that these both actually divide. So we end up getting x is equal to 10 divided by 2 is 5, plus or minus 10 divided by 2 is 5i. Okay? So that would be our solution, or we can write out our two solutions, which is x is equal to 5 plus 5i, or x is equal to 5 minus 5i. And again, those would be our two solutions. All right. Let's look at this example. So let's solve by completing the square. So in case you guys forgot, completing the square means that we're going to create perfect squares. So the first thing we want to do, so we got x squared minus 5x plus 20 is move over the 20. And we're going to do that by adding its opposite. So we're going to subtract 20 from each side. All right. So we subtract 20. And now we're left with x squared minus 5x. And I'm going to put a plus this blank space because we're going to fill it in when we complete the square is equal to negative 20. And remember that this new c value is going to be added to both sides. Okay. So now what we want to do is identify our b. So our b is negative 5. And what we're going to do with that is take negative 5 divided by 2, okay, which gives us negative 2.5. And what we're going to do with this value now is square this term. Okay, so when we take 2.5 squared, that's going to equal to 6.25. Okay, so we're gonna add 6.25 to each side. Okay, all right, so the next thing we're gonna do, okay, we're gonna go ahead and factor the left-hand side, and it turns out that the left-hand side, okay, so remember we got AC, we got B, our B is -5, so we got -2.5 times -2.5 gives us the 6.25, and the -2.5 plus -2.5 is -5. So we got x minus 2.5 times x minus 2.5 is equal to -13.75. So now we got x minus 2.5 squared is equal to -13.75. We want to solve this. Okay, so in order to solve this, we have to take the square root of each side. So now we got x minus 2.5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of -13.75. Okay, and so again we want to get x by itself, so the next thing we're going to do is add 2.5 to both sides. Okay, that gets rid of that. We're going to write this in the front, so now we get x equals 2.5 plus or minus, now remember we have this negative, so we're going to pull out the I. So it's going to be I times the square root of 13.75. Okay, and that would be our final answer. All right, so if you guys have any questions, remember that I will be hosting a Zoom meeting Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10:30 to 11. So make sure that you guys do log in and get your questions answered.